So tonight's agenda, we've got 3 presentations, and then we'll have a panel discussion facilitated by Katrina Kidson. Katrina will take questions from the floor, so please save your questions till the end, and make them really hard ones, please. Our first presentation will be from a husband and wife team, Nathan Edmondston and Dr. Yuki Fukuda. They moved from Hamilton to Nelson about 6 years ago and have a 6-year-old daughter. Nathan is a registered architect and chair of the Nelson Marlborough branch of NZIA, and has a strong interest in low carbon architecture. Yuki studied ecology at Lincoln University after spending her first 18 years in Tokyo. She gained her PhD from the University of Queensland, studying the impact of climate change on ecosystems. Since 2007, Yuki has been working on various mitigation projects, including promoting tree planting on farms. She joined Zero Carbon Nelson Tasman last year, and their goals are to mitigate emissions, help our region adapt to climate change and transition to a low carbon society. Our second presentation is from Greg Bennett. Greg is currently a stormwater engineer with the Waimakariri District Council. In his spare time, he's chair of the Coastal Restoration Trust of New Zealand, Te Huna Ora. His interest in the coastal environment was generated by living at Amberley Beach and appreciating how dynamic the beach environment can be during the seasons and cycles of tides and weather. And we're very lucky to have Chris here tonight, that we've caught him on his way from Canterbury up to Wellington. Our final presentation is from Dr. Chris Cameron. Chris is the climate change champion at Nelson City Council. He has a PhD in climate science and has a long-standing interest in climate impacts and appropriate responses. Chris was a member of the organising committee and keynote speaker for the 2012 New Zealand Climate Change Centre Conference on sea level rise, and commissioned a groundbreaking report for Wellington City Council in 2013 on the impacts of sea level rise across the 4 well-beings for that city. Now, Chris isn't actually here tonight, he's not in town, but we have him on our video conference call. We have him on our video conference call, sorry about that. And we have a pre-recorded presentation from him, which we'll put up later. Sorry about that. Before our first presentation, I just want to set out some ground rules. So, there's been a lot of interest in this event from members of our organisation who can't be here tonight. So we have set up an ability to record the event, and we're doing that now, and we're hoping to be able to release that to our members and members of NZIA afterwards so they can see the presentations having not been here. So you just need to be aware that it is being recorded. Because we have remote attendees, we have a little microphone down here which will pick up the speakers really, really well, but it will also pick up all the background noise. So it'd be really great if you could try and keep background noise to an absolute minimum, particularly during the panel discussion. Having the three presenters who are here, plus Katrina, plus Chris, all chiming in from the video conference, and we'll also try and take questions from our Marlborough colleagues as well. So it'd be really appreciated if you could be quiet. Please feel free to help yourself to all the food and drinks that's at the back of the room. There's heaps still there, so please do get stuck in. In terms of timing, the presenters all have 15 minutes each. We'll give them a wee warning when they get about 2 minutes out from that. We will probably have about 45 minutes for questions and answers at the end for the panel discussion. Most importantly, we are not here to debate the science of climate change. We just want to focus on the response to sea level rise, so those questions won't be allowed. Sorry if that disappoints you. Now I'll hand over to Nathan Anderson and Dr. Yuki Fukuda. Thank you.
Hey, I'm Nathan, this is Yuki, just in case you're wondering. I probably also need to put a disclaimer out there as well. So the presentation that I'm giving, it's my personal views. It's not necessarily the views of the Institute or any other organisations I'm associated with. So I'll just put that out there to start with. Right, so we're here today to talk about sea level rise. So we don't necessarily have all the answers, but our intent is to start that conversation so that we can start to come up with solutions moving forward. So as a community, we can find out the best way to move forward as the sea level rises. So New Zealand has the 9th longest coastline in the world, just over 15,000 kilometres. So we are going to be affected by sea level rise. And this region has already happened. 2018, Manako was inundated with sea level rise, or a storm event that came through. Beach Road, waves coming over the main road. Ruby Bay, and even the airport was inundated. And that didn't stop us from building a $32 million airport terminal in that location. Beautiful building, but and then Lower Queen Street, that has in the last 10 years probably been inundated twice, and we're still developing residential sections in close to these areas.
So a business as usual approach, which means doing nothing, is no good because sea level is going to rise and our house is going to be flooded. So CO2 levels are at their highest in 800,000 years. And our species, Homo sapiens, started evolving around 300,000 years ago. So we are in an unprecedented situation now. Last time CO2 was this level, it was 2 to 4 million years ago. And our ancestors looked like this. And at that time, sea level was 18 to 24 meters higher than the current level. There are two reasons, two factors contributing to the sea level rise. So we've heated the planet by 1.1 degrees already, so ice is melting around the world. And also water expands in volume when it's heated. The rate of sea level rise was gradual to start off with. In the last couple hundred years, it took about 200 years to reach 20 centimeters of sea level rise. But in the next 40 years, we are expecting another 30 centimeters of sea level rise, and that rate is accelerating. So sea level will continue to rise in the next several hundred years. And even if we stop emissions tomorrow, globally, it doesn't stop the sea level rise. It can slow it down, but it can't stop it. And business as usual emission trajectory will take us about 3.3 meters of sea level rise by 2300. So some of you might think, how about we put seawalls to protect the coastal areas? And I'll give you an example from Japan. Taro district is north of Fukushima and epicenter of 2011 earthquake. And this coastline regularly received tsunami, but after 1933 event, they've decided to put a 10-meter seawall, and it was for a length of 2.8 kilometers, and it was the biggest scale in Japan. So people from all over the world came to have a look, and the residents were very proud. It protected the township like this egg-shaped, and but the tsunami reached 17 meters and devastated the township. And the mortality rate from this township was higher per capita compared to other places that didn't have the extensive seawalls. Some of those seawalls remained intact, but the other places were completely destroyed. So they've done a managed retreat, 40 to 60 meters above sea level, and they put baseball field and other important stuff around the waterfront.
So the other option that you might be considering is raising the floor level of existing buildings in and around these areas, and that's one of the things that's built into the district plans in the area, and it's one of the only mechanisms councils have to deal with sea level rise. But when you look at the areas that are going to be affected by inundation, you can start to see the scale in which we need to start lifting how many houses, existing buildings are in these areas that are going to be affected. And then we start thinking about the infrastructure that's under these buildings that takes away our stormwater and our sewers. And our sewage treatment plants are all coastal as well. So as sea level rise, these are all going to be affected. And these systems predominantly function on gravity feed to get you out of the building. So as sea level rise, these things are no longer going to function in the same way. And then we get onto insurance retreat. So with 20 centimetres more sea level rise, a 1 in 100 year event is going to happen more frequently, more like 1 in 20 years. And at that point, insurance companies are going to start retreating from coastal properties, and you're no longer going to be able to insure those properties. So if you have no insurance, you will no longer have the ability to actually get a mortgage on those properties, which makes them hard to sell. So maybe you're the lucky one and you managed to pay off your mortgage and you elevated your house above that inundation zone. Your neighbours probably weren't as lucky. So effectively you're living in this ghost town where all the neighbours' houses are abandoned. This is what it might look like. Essential services such as toilet paper will have to be carried via a boat to your front door, and then rubbish and other things need to be taken away in the same manner. And then we start looking at legislation that's going to start going through government. So the Managed Retreat and Climate Adaptation Bill, it's going to extinguish land use rights, or it may do. It's going through Parliament at the moment, it's in discussion. And it's going to give councils the ability to no longer be required to upgrade infrastructure that's in vulnerable areas. So you're effectively going to be living in a red zone. And then our commitments under the Paris Agreement. So to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, we need to reduce emissions by 50% in the next 9 years. So if we look at the environment in terms of the bathtub, the emissions that we're putting into the bathtub are effectively, from our cars and from our airplane travel. What comes out is the same as the plug. So what the environment is effectively able to absorb is what comes out of the plug. We need to reduce the amount of water we're putting into this bathtub so that it low. The way we're building at the moment, however, we're building as though we don't care if that bathtub's going to overflow. So a standard house at the moment is going to use 7 times the allowable carbon budget that we have over its lifetime. So that we have to start looking at the materials we're using. So concrete and steel are emission-heavy products, and they're used a lot in the construction industry. We need to be moving towards timber as a predominant material that we're using, and moving, timber.
So another issue we are facing is energy descent, the end of cheap oil. Energy return on energy invested, the value used to be quite high in early last century. However, low-hanging fruit is gone. So now we move to deep sea oil. We are actually using more oil to extract oil, which means less is available for the economy. In the next 20 years, it's likely that 20% reduction in net energy availability is going to happen, which means we are approaching an net energy cliff very shortly. So this means we need to be building the right kind of buildings and the infrastructure in the right place very soon, because future generations may not have that opportunity to do so. So sea level rise, and energy descent are likely to impact many countries simultaneously. So unlike Christchurch earthquake event, where many countries came to help us, we are now on. No one's going to come and help us in us dealing with sea level change. So this might be a bit too much for some of you, so I'll go through the 5 stages of grief. first you deny that problem exists, and then you feel angry afterwards. And then bargaining, if I stop eating red meat once a week, can I still holiday in Europe? And then depression. So if we denial, as a society, we are burying our heads in the sand. And if we choose maladaptive strategies such as do nothing, or putting seawalls up, or raising the minimal level of the floor, we're going to, one way or another, we're going to be forced to retreat and have a civil unrest and more rubbish in the ocean and damage coastal infrastructure and buildings. And are we going to be asking our children to tidy up our mess because we didn't have the courage to take appropriate actions in time? I think we can do better. The good news is we are one of the very, very luckiest countries in the world. We have very low population density and we have plenty of land away from the coast to move to. Other countries are not so lucky. Denmark, highest point is 170 meters above sea level. Netherlands, highest point is 300 meters above sea level. Now those countries, they don't have any other options but to fight against the rising sea. And while we have lots of mitigation measures that we can learn from them, I don't think we should be learning adaptation strategies from these countries because energy descent and carbon budget means those strategies may not be viable in the long term.
The next thing we need to look at is how we develop. So our current strategy is to take farmland and turn it into urban subdivisions. And we need to look at how we can reverse that. So as sea level rises, we're going to have less farmland. So we need to start bringing food sources and urban agriculture into the middle of the cities. And then we need to look at ways we can measure our success. So at the moment we have Homestar, Green Star, Passive House, Living Building Challenge. Are these tools good enough to tell us that we are doing enough to mitigate emissions from the buildings? I think the only one that probably starts to approach that is the Living Building Challenge. And then start thinking about, looking at how other nations are actually functioning. So in Japan, they have timber buildings that are over 1,300 years old. So if we look at how they are building these buildings to last this long, there's a lot that can be learnt from these techniques that have been around for a very long time. And then what does our future look like? Are we going to be living in high-rise timber buildings? Are there other ways of developing our future communities? Co-housing, for example, so community gardens, shared vehicles. And then if we start retreating from the coast, we can start looking at other mechanisms for how we develop our city as well. So the idea of the 15-minute neighbourhood. So having all the amenities that we need, all the infrastructure and everything we need within 15 minutes, walk or cycle ride from where we live. So reducing the need to commute in fossil fuel cars.
So it feels unnerving having to navigate, uncharted territory, and sort of having to move away from beach and rivers to which we have strong connections to. But Aotearoa is a country of migrants and their descendants. The first Maori settlers took huge risks crossing the vast ocean, and they've abandoned everything they've known and loved. But they did it because they believed that the life on the new island would be better. Same with European settlers, 6 months on a leaky boat. But they did it because they wanted to give their children a better future. So we must summon our courage and work together and move just a little bit away from the coast areas, and so we can give better future for our children. Conclusion: the atmospheric CO2 concentration is all-time high. The rate of sea level rise will accelerate over time. Doing nothing is not an option. And seawalls, while we may not have tsunami as big as Japan does, but we do get storm surges, and they will become more frequent and intense in the future. But we don't think seawall is the way to go, because it gives us full sense of security, and because of the energy descent and reduced carbon budget would mean in 50 years when we have to replace them or maintain them, we may not be able to do so. Raising minimum floor level up and up. Oh, sorry. It's not good because of the insurance retreat and forthcoming legislation. So the only logical option is to do preemptive managed retreat. And what would be even better is to, after removing all the roads and infrastructure buildings away from the low-lying areas, we can do habitat restoration. And I think Greg's gonna show some examples of that in his talk. This retreat needs to incorporate mitigation approaches like low carbon architecture and 15-minute city. And next 9 years is absolutely crucial. We need to get discussion going so we can develop a vision for our collective future. And through discussion, we are hoping that we can come up with creative solutions, innovations, collaborations, and so on. And through that, we'll get this. We'll get through this together. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Greg ahau, ko Tiamana o Tāhuna ora o Aotearoa. Chairperson of the Coastal Restoration Trust of New Zealand, and that's something I do in my spare time. And I've been chairperson since 2013, and in my day job, I'm a stormwater engineer. So, and I'm here to talk to you on behalf of the Trust, and to introduce the Trust. And if I just want to ask a question, who here has heard of us before? Who has not heard of us? We've been around for quite a while. Been a Trust since 2008. Our predecessor organisation was called the Coastal Dune Vegetation Network, and that was around from the mid-90s. And prior to that, the function of looking after the coast, especially the sand dunes, was our New Zealand Forest Service. So, also I'd like to ask, so we have an annual conference that's coming up in Wanganui next year in March. And at every conference, I ask how many engineers in the house, and I ask for the hand to raise up. So, how many engineers in the house? I'm usually the only one at our conference, so I don't often get an opportunity to talk to people in my profession. And I'm not going to make any apologies. I'm going to be a bit hard on us tonight. So, yeah, I'll get into it. That is Tāwhiri Mātia, god of wind and storms. Now, if you know the creation stories of the Māori, it's a really cool story. They got awesome stories, and our gods will kick the Norse gods' ass. But anyway, this is Tāwhiri Mātia. So in the beginning, Papatūnuku, the Earth Mother, and Ranginui Sky Father were locked in an embrace. They had a few sons, about 70 odd sons, who were stuck in between them somehow. Anyway, some of the gods didn't like it, and some of them tried to pry apart their parents, and it was Tāne, one of the younger gods, Tāne Mahuta, god of the forests and birds and insects and stuff. He pushed his legs up and he separated his parents. It was a bit more involved in that, but anyway, Tāwhiri Mātia didn't like it. He was angry. So he started fighting with all the other gods, and there were two, Tangaroa, god of the sea, he was a bit upset. He was initially for separating his parents, and so he was fighting against Tāwhiri Mātia, but his sons, Ika Tere, god of fishes, and Tu Te Wehe, god of reptiles, they were Tangaroa's sons, and they hid. Tāne protected them from Tāwhiri Mātia. So Tangaroa didn't like that, he got jealous. And so he started a battle with Tāne that goes on to this day. So I'll get back to our gods a bit later on. So when presented with this, I was thinking, what are the options for top of the south for sea level rise? And I had to think, well, I'm going to pose another question. Is sea level rise a problem? And when we, so this is out of our, if you go to our website, we've got all sorts of good resources. This is out of our Coastal Restoration Handbook. It is mostly about managing sand dunes, but we're adding to it, and we're going to be, we're moving into the estuary space and those sorts of shores as well. But you look at our language in our thing, we don't have any negative language. So if we focus on what's wrong, we miss opportunity, and we're all humans and we've got this negativity bias. We're always looking for something that's wrong. So I'm going to sort of a bit of a paradox. I'm going to point out a few things that I might think is wrong, but I'm going to try and be objective about it. So this is Granity, and that's the Granity School. Over time there's been some work. If you're familiar with Granity, they've got they're experiencing coastal erosion. And anyway, Granity School, which has probably about 20 kids in their role, and they had some coastal erosion, and so they got some funding from the Ministry of Education. In 2016, $250,000 was put towards putting a seawall in front of the school. And I understand, talking to someone over the West Coast just this week, that seawall has not coped that well. And I think that $250,000 would go a long way to educating kids rather than trying to hold back the sea. And maybe they could have moved the school. This is my point. We've got something wrong going on. We've got coastal erosion. We must do something about it. The opportunity was, hey, let's move the school away. This is closer to my home, and so this is a culvert. It cost about $200K. Kirihurunui Council put it in to drain the area behind. There's a community there at Amberley Beach that periodically get a bit of rainfall, and they like to drain the land. So they've got to drain it out through there. The council decided to put that in right there, and so they've committed themselves to having that road, which feeds a golf course. You ask me, well, I'll ask you, do you think it's worth it? They have to get a digger in to dig out the front of it. So this is just down the coast a bit, Leithfield Beach. This is a pipe that's about 10 years old. That's what Tangaroa is doing to it. It's having a good old feed of the concrete. This is what it's for. It's to actually just provide a base flow outlet for a rather cute little stream called Leithfield Stream. So we got all sorts of guides and policy statement. There's a coastal policy statement. You're probably all familiar with it. I hope you are. I've just highlighted a few things that just stand out for me, as we've got to discourage hard protection structures, restoration or enhancement of natural features, and relocation and removal of existing development or structures at risk, and we've got to look long term. We've got to look a century ahead. So those are the key things I think we should take out of that. And then, of course, the government has come up with all sorts of other advice and stuff that all good resources and what we should be abiding by with. And yeah. So this one, who's familiar with Orewa? And you're aware of the seawall that's going ahead up there, or planning on it? No? Rodney District Council applied for a resource consent to build a seawall here, and it got declined. So they shelved it, and then the Auckland amalgamation of the councils happened, and so the Auckland Council dusted off the resource consent application, got some consultants involved, and presented a case to the council, and it went to commissioners, and the commissioners declined the consent. And then the Auckland Council went to the Environment Court, and they had to decide, can we take ourselves to the Environment Court? And then the Environment Court said, yes, you can. So that's that point there. And if you see down the bottom here, so far that process, $650,000 has been spent in this process to build a seawall and promenade at Orewa Beach. Now, we shouldn't be, as taxpayers and ratepayers, we shouldn't be forking out stuff that's sort of money. It's and our, the people that are providing the advice to the councils and stuff, they should be really thinking about it. It's been through the Environment Court. They've been granted a very cut back version. Now what they're trying to do is keep this council public space in front of private property, and this is what's going to affect us in New Zealand. Is there's a lot of public space that's going to be squeezed up and then affect private property, so public access will no longer be enjoyed by New Zealanders around the coast. So in 1955, one landowner here at Orewa Beach decided, he found out his property boundary was down in the sand somewhere. So he moved, he filled it up and built a wall, and then slowly his neighbours followed suit, including the council. So the places at this beach where the sea is still eroding, it's still filled. The beach has not returned back to its original position. So that's what we've got to look at as coastal processes, but that's why a hell of a lot of money has been spent here, is because we're trying to artificially keep the shoreline from where it naturally should be. Let's see if this works. I hope it does.
The tiny west coast settlement of Granity's become known as the capital of coastal erosion. The town's been slipping into the sea for years, but now some hardy and creative residents believe they've found a way to fight back. Thomas Mead has their story.
Towering over the beach at Granity, a fortress of interlocking concrete blocks, designed, built and funded by men who refuse to surrender their homes to the Tasman Sea.
It's the West Coast attitude, I suppose. If you want something done, you just get out and do it. Yeah.
The design, known as Westlock, was driven by scenes like this on the west coast of the South Island. Storms bringing the ocean literally onto Granity's doorstep. The only defence to date, this temporary rock wall.
Doesn't matter how big you do them, 10-ton ones, they all just wash out to sea. And after a while, a group of us got together, we decided we're going to come up with a better solution.
It was a simple but clever idea, a network of concrete blocks made into hexagons so they're locked together. It's taken 4 years to raise the funds, find a manufacturer, get the engineering certification and start a trial. And where better to test an idea than your very own backyard?
When you've got these blocks at 2 tonne each, and in this case here we've got 200 of them, we've got a mass of about 400 tonne, all locked together, no way any of them can move.
But what started as an attempt to solve their own problems could have a much bigger impact. Coastal erosion is forecast to become one of humanity's most significant problems as we grapple with climate change.
And we've been told by engineers before, how come nobody's actually thought of this idea before? So, yeah, it's probably more of a fluke, I don't know, but yeah.
And if it works, these coasters might just find the world banging on their door. Thomas Mead, One News.
So there's with sea walls, there's end effect erosion, and this is an open coast beach. So I think it will accelerate erosion on either side of the seawall. I think that's going to be a major effect. One comment he made was 10-tonne boulders on the beach don't work. Well, they don't unless you place them properly. Oh yeah, this was the paragraph. This is their application. Page of it, sort of, yeah. Do you propose to undertake any kind of monitoring, private property owner to monitor supervised trial data? What data? Yeah. Anyway, so that, I'll put this one up. This is Cook's Beach off Whaihanga. Now this is another private seawall, and this one I'd say this one was built properly. I'm interested to see how it will last, but in behind there is they've shaped the foreshore. Okay, they've got a primary layer and they've got a layer underneath that, but those rocks have been designed. Each rock has been placed individually. They've been a specified size. And when the sea hits that wall, it gets swallowed up, and all the energy, well, most of the energy is just swallowed up by that wall. Now that's a properly designed one. Now they've got issues, but of course, you know, that's the difference you get from, you know, throwing rocks on the beach. Anyway, I'm up for to do, because I've got a few more. I've talked too much. Shall I just? Well, I'll go through these very quickly, flick through these very quickly. The government's coming out with some great stuff. You know, this is about living in a disrupted climate. This is on Solgan website. Interesting here, they say human settlements only in safe zones. That's the future. My wife and I attempted to walk around Wales, the coast of Wales. So this church is a 12th century church in Wales, and it's now in the ocean. It's on its own little island. That's where it is. So what I saw in Wales was they have a history, a whole history of trying to, you know, that they know where the coastline was 600, 800 years ago. And that's our blog if you're interested to go and see our trip around Wales. So now back to the question. So this is the options I can come up with. Just flick through them. Listen to the science or not, and the science includes all of the sciences. Listen to the ratepayer or not, and you can choose not to or choose to, because sometimes ratepayers don't have very good ideas. You've got all those policies. You can adhere to them or not, you can spend lots of dollars or not, and you can focus on what's wrong or not, and you can learn from past experience or not. Depending on where you are in the country, you can go build your own seawall in Granity, but don't try and own one. And you can stay out of the way of battling gods or not. So we've got an opportunity to introduce some resilience into our coastlines and our communities, and this is the positive part of my talk. Just flick through very, very quickly. Thanks. Back to Tāne Mahuta. he tried to make peace with Tangiroa, and he plucked out his eyebrows and he gave them to Tangiroa as a peace offering. And Tangiroa didn't want to have any part of it, so he threw the eyebrows back onto the sand, and there they grew. So this is Phacinia spiralis, which is our indigenous sand sedge peanut, and that grows and protects our foreshore. This is the other plant, that major plant that we should be treating with respect. That's Jo Bonner from Coastlands Nurseries, and she knows all about growing this plant. She is the person to go to. Now, if you've got coastal planting projects, you must plan in advance. She doesn't she doesn't just sell them to anybody. You have to pre-order them. And please look after them when you get them to your nursery. So this is our handbook. Please go on our website and have a look. We've got all sorts of stuff in it. This is a coastal monitoring database. So we're setting this up so we can monitor our whole coast of New Zealand using citizen science. Yep. Got a planting calculator. I use this one for streamside planting. It's great. We've got we're constantly updating this. You want to know anything about the coastal science, we've got all of the references and a lot of the papers there as well. And just flick through those to the end.
Thank you, Greg. I'm sorry to rush.
Tēnā koutou katoa and good evening. Getting to the stage of identifying options for response to sea level rise means understanding which areas are at risk, what our vulnerabilities are, not just in dollar terms, but across the four well-beings. For example, some areas will be more affected from an environmental perspective, while others might contain a range of key infrastructure assets. In this talk, I'm going to explore a number of important considerations from a council perspective, but also more broadly. For example, I strongly believe we must operate across council boundaries and between agencies nationally to ensure consistency and joined-up responses. Many of these considerations need to be worked through before we even begin to decide on the best responses to address sea level rise. So, change is coming. We've all heard the projections of what climate change is likely to bring. And we've begun to experience those changes firsthand. Looking more broadly than sea level rise, we've seen the droughts, the fires, the storms, and then the coastal inundation, and the impacts that all these things can bring. Infrastructure and property damage, business and social disruption, financial cost, as well as damage to our ecosystems. So essentially there is a radically different world coming, and the key aspect to me of climate change is actually the word change. How do we shift ourselves to be change ready as opposed to change responsive? Sea level rise should be one of the highest priority areas of focus for any council community. And for key industries such as yours, as we will see, engineering plays a key role in preparing for this challenging future. So what might this future look like under several different scenarios? If we don't act deliberately, we're effectively carrying on with business as usual, wait and see what happens, and respond and fix it when it does happen. So this is likely to be both costly and disruptive. If we are reactive rather than being proactive, this is likely to be non-strategic, considering perhaps immediate risks, but not the longer term ones, which may result in outcomes such as increasing exposure in areas that will increase in risk over time. This is also likely to be an expensive option. What does it look like if we act most effectively? Well, this might involve working across our community to look at how we want this region to look in, say, 100 years or more, and responding accordingly, working our way back from that point. This involves creating a vision and then bringing it back to how we should respond today, including how we prioritize our work. This chart shows several sea level rise projections out to 2150 from MFE. And as we can see, the trend is towards an accelerating pace of sea level rise over time. So what I've done is I've included several of our current council plans, strategies and policies on the chart, indicating their timeframes. So this ranges from annual plans through to so-called long-term plans, which actually only go out 10 years, to a number of more aspirational plans that extend as far as 2070. So the top widest arrow here doesn't yet exist, showing quite clearly that we don't have strategies that address this longer term and the most severe impacts accelerating over time that will be experienced from sea level rise. So to address this gap, we may need an adaptation strategy or framework or an agreed spatial plan to drive those other plans and strategies from the top down. So turning to a number of key considerations. Firstly, a regional focus. We need to ask ourselves as a city and as a region, again across the four well-beings, what do we value? Usually economic development is a high priority for councils, and typically 80% of council budget goes into infrastructure. So a lot of power sits with the engineers. But with growing costs of climate change, rates might need to increase and development might need to be more closely scrutinised. Councils really struggle with the concept of business picking up sticks and going elsewhere. Secondly, a few words on timeframes. This can be looked at both in terms of what needs to happen in the short term and what needs to happen in the long term to manage our regions most appropriately. So, short term, what do we do now with our existing infrastructure, property and assets to respond to sea level rise? Currently, we have a focus on maintaining levels of service, but we may need to in fact lower our expectations in some cases or for some locations. Should we maintain assets or networks in high-risk locations, or should we increasingly focus our investments elsewhere where the risk is lower? We need to shift our practice to reflect the fact that some assets may not deliver their full lifespan in some at-risk locations, or even in locations that can expect to become more exposed in the future. Then moving to thinking about the longer-term view. This becomes less of an asset management question, but more of a strategic one. Sea level rise has been described as a slow-motion tsunami. So how would we respond if we knew that a major tsunami was going to hit? We'd probably evacuate people from at-risk areas, move as much property out of harm's way as we could, and aim to minimize the damage. Should our response with sea level rise really be that much different? Turning to the question of urgency. As we know, infrastructure solutions take time. Look at Transmission Gully for an example. It's been a 40+ year process. So that means starting now to think about major changes that need to occur with our infrastructure. Starting now allows for us to develop options, option analysis, option development, costing, for decision making, for development of policy and regulation or legislation, and finally for the planning and construction. Time is required whether you're thinking about defence options or retreat options, and both require considerable engineering input. Looking at the question of zoning. So zoning, unfortunately, hazard zones suggest safety if you're on the right side of the line, and they suggest risk if you're on the wrong side of that line. Additionally, zones need to be altered over time to reflect changing circumstances. For example, as we move from planning for 1 metre of sea level rise to 2 metres of sea level rise. And being outside of an identified coastal hazard zone now may not in fact be safe in the long term. And it's likely to see increased development, putting more property and infrastructure at risk over time. These factors strongly suggest the need for a new flexible, adaptive management approach with changes made over several district plans or regional plans? What if those regional spatial plans or adaptation strategies or frameworks become the driving force that controls what happens in those district or regional plans? Some of the proposed changes to the Resource Management Act might be moving us in this direction, and that can only be a good thing. So carrying on then to some other considerations. Question of affordability. We often hear that the costs of sea level rise are going to be huge. How big? Insurance payouts following the 2015 South Dunedin flooding cost around $28 million. So some estimates predict a 50-fold increase in such damages with just 30 centimetres of sea level rise. And those costs are likely to increasingly not be covered by the insurance industry as they retreat from high-risk areas. So others may need to pay what insurance won't cover, and this is likely to come back to ratepayers and taxpayers. And they, in turn, need to understand how the various options to respond stack up financially. What will be both feasible and affordable? There was an interesting analysis out of Christchurch following the earthquakes there. Orion Energy ran a program before the earthquakes called Invest and Save, where they invested around $6 million to increase the resilience of their network. They calculated that they made savings of around $65 million in avoided losses in the Christchurch earthquakes. A pretty good return on investment. Looking at the question of collaboration, it's so important. Creating a common vision will need input from all viewpoints, including iwi, asset managers, engineers, planners, community members, and so on. In short, everyone needs to be involved in shaping that aspiration. And so this requires proper engagement in a two-way dialogue, which is open, inviting, well facilitated, and directed towards seeking buy-in and progress over an extended period of time. Neither a one-off nor a one-way process of limited scope will cut it. So it'll take time to get to proposing, assessing, and deciding on appropriate responses to sea level rise, and then transforming that into a plan with regulatory standing. Looking now at the question of principles. So it seems really important to have some guiding principles on how we do respond, so we don't end up going down a pathway of maladaptation, for example. So I've thought of a few potential principles that we could have. So one example is adapting to change, including through transformation, is key to New Zealand's well-being. The second one might be involving all communities of interest in decision-making will be critical to successful adaptation. And a third could be sharing both costs and decision-making equitably across the community will ensure the best outcomes. You might be able to think of some other principles that we operate by as we start to consider how we respond to sea level rise. And this quote here starts to really pull together these threads and considerations that I've covered. Real progress can only be made with collaborative action across disciplines and across communities. No single individual or organisation can solve it alone. I wanted to take a slight detour here to look at one of the ways that sea level rise has been responded to elsewhere. So this is the state of Louisiana in the USA, which, as we know, was hit very hard by Hurricane Katrina in 2006. So this map shows areas most susceptible to sea level rise in dark blue, those moderately at risk in mid blue, and low risk in light blue. So there's no real surprises here. The low-lying areas nearest the coast are those that are most vulnerable. But what they've then done is said, what capacity do we have to accommodate population growth in low-risk areas and facilitate population reduction in those higher-risk areas? Of course, implementing such changes might be the more challenging task here. However, this provides one component of what can inform the eventual decisions that are needing to be taken. To finish, here's a couple of relevant quotes. This one from New Zealand and from someone in the insurance industry. Don't keep calm and carry on. Business as usual is not an option. And the second one here, the best way to predict the future is to create it. It's highly unlikely that we will like what happens to us if we don't get creating our own future. So finally, thank you for listening, and I look forward to the panel discussion. Kia ora.
Tēnā koutou e te whānau. It's lovely to be here. And my first question, I'll just start with some questions, is really to the whole panel, and it comes back to He Waka Eke Noa, we're all in this together. And we've seen a really good response from the team of 5 million to COVID. My question is, what should we, the people in this room, be doing? What do we need to be doing? What do we need to be doing differently right now? I'm going to ask Chris to start with a response to that.
Yeah, thanks, Katrina. Good evening, everyone. Look, good question. Look, I think, that's something during COVID where we asked ourselves, to what extent can we recover and can we move forward from our situation into something different, and what is it that we need to change? How do we change? So, look, I think this is a similar opportunity that actually, we can't get by on carrying on doing what we've always done. So what do we do differently? Look, I think from an engineering perspective, as I said in my talk, I think there's a lot there that we need to think of in terms of how do we engineer for managed retreat. It was interesting to see Yuki's example in Japan where, I think the retreat was probably forced retreat rather than managed retreat. The way that government is looking at reviewing the RMA suggests to me that there's an opportunity there to be thinking about a Managed Retreat Act and to be thinking about how we embrace the way to be thinking about that differently. The Resource Management Act has been designed for a static environment, and we're no longer in that static environment. We need regulation and legislation that can support us to adapt and change faster as that change accelerates.
So we need legislation. So what do us engineers and architects, what's our role? What do we do over the next, when we leave this room, what do we do? What do we do over the next few months? Are we waiting for the legislation?
Yeah, look, I think one of the things, someone mentioned there, the coastal policy statement, that actually, we need to be looking at challenging building or creating structures or maintaining structures even in places that are either at risk now or are likely to become more at risk in the future. And so, yes, you might be able to find some engineering solutions to buy us time, but really that's all it's doing. So I think that's, that to me is part of the fundamental questioning from the engineering perspective. Is what I'm doing buying us time, or is it a long-term solution? And that's really what we need to be moving towards, is longer-term solutions that we don't sink money into things that are not going to see us through in the long term.
Probably the end of my talk, really, because my advice is stay away from battling gods, and in that zone just plant up native vegetation all along our estuary margins, our sand dunes, all along our shores, everywhere. Is just create natural buffers that move with the cycles and protect us from those tawhiri mātia when he's angry.
I suppose from an architectural point of view, I'm thinking we just go with your gut. I think we know that we often treat the building code as a target when it's not, and we should be going above the legislation that we currently have, because it really, if we're looking into the future, it's really not strong enough at the moment. There are changes coming, but those changes are going to take time. So we need to be proactive now. We need to think about the future, because it's the next generation that it's going to affect.
What I'd love to see is, stopping development in the low-lying areas, because we will, or somebody will have to remove those buildings and infrastructure, including all the roads, before sea claims them. And in that sense, I have questions for engineering communities. Do we have mechanisms of removing those infrastructure, for example, road, and then move it somewhere else, and can we reuse those things? The infrastructure underground, can we reuse them? And that's the kind of thing maybe solution can be have a wide applications globally.
Thank you, everyone. I have another question, and perhaps it's a question about how do we help council with this? I mean, I don't know if anyone still actually gets the paper, but this is the paper from Friday the 16th of October, and the front page, there's a report here about the climate risk bill slammed, which is a developer wanting to develop in the wood and spending $60,000 on modelling, on flood level and sea level rise modelling. And it seems to me a lot of money for one developer on the wood to be spending that. And surely as a community, we should know what we want to be doing down in the wood, even and have the modelling done. So Chris, I know that council's doing some modelling, and there's an update of that coming. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about where council's at, about providing us with the information about what's predicted for us as a community.
Yeah, thanks, Katrina. So, look, the stage we're at is within the next month, we're looking to put out some coastal inundation maps as part of the Nelson Plan community consultation. So, many of you will be aware that the Nelson Plan is currently under consultation. At this stage, those coastal inundation maps have not yet been released, but that's planned to happen soon. So look, that's I guess the first opportunity for people to really get their teeth into what it might look like for Nelson. And I don't think there's too many surprises there. That most people are aware that where the low-lying areas are and where the risks are. So it's really starting to think about, okay, what do we do about that? What do we want to see done as a community, and how might we go about that? So for me, I'm starting to put together some thinking around how we create an climate adaptation framework, what that looks like in terms of both community engagement and continuing that discussion on beyond the Nelson Plan, but also about what more information do we need in terms of risk assessment, in terms of modelling, to fill any gaps that we don't yet have that information on, and then to take it to some thinking around, okay, there might be some potential solutions that might be structural, that might be protection for a time. How do those stack up? How does a protection option compare against a managed retreat option financially? But also, how do we build into that discussion around our ecosystems, around our communities, around our cultural areas of importance, and really cross all of those four well-beings. So yeah, there's a lot to think of there, and to me, it's also that conversation needs to be a structured and facilitated one, that's well managed, that's ongoing, but also achieves things along the way. So there is quite a lot to all of that.
Thanks, Chris. I almost feel like I want to ask the room, is like, are we going to be engaged in this? It often council does this sort of work, and we sit back and wait, and don't submit and don't engage. But hasn't in the past been an easy process for us to engage with. But I mean, I put the challenge out to the room: is how do we engage with this? This is for engineers, architects, the people in the room. We've got a massive amount of expertise, and we should be helping our community with this. So we have a question about that.
Yeah, I just wondered to ask this wonderful audience how much responsibility the engineers, architects, developers should have for the carbon footprint of what they produce.
Yeah.
How much personal responsibility do they feel?
Yeah, so the question is, how much personal responsibility do we feel for the carbon footprint of the work we're designing, the work we're involved in? I think that's a good question. But Chris, if we do want to get involved, how do we get involved? What's the story with that, and how do we keep engaged rather than walk out of this room and hope that Chris solves the world?
Yeah. Look, good question, Katrina, and you're posing a few good questions there. So look, you know, as I say, we're starting off with the Nelson Plan and those coastal inundation maps. Get engaged with that process, have a look at them, say what you'd like to see happen. You know, and also we need to, as I say, we need to design a process that's robust, that does engage people, and that in fact takes some of that expectation away from council. Council can't do it all. It needs to be communities taking ownership, people wanting to be involved, seeing the importance and urgency of these issues, and putting their hand up. So, yeah, look, you know, that's the sorts of things that I'll be pushing for, and designing a process to make it interesting, to make it engaging, and to make it work.
Great. I look forward to the whole room being involved in that as well. We have a hand being waved at the back.
Yeah, I've got I'm Nancy Taylor, I'm Marketing Manager for the City Council. So I'm going along with my colleagues who Rob will be running some of the hosting mapping sessions over the last part of November. So I'm really supportive coming along, giving us some feedback about what we're looking at. But as Chris said, it's quite a long process with various steps to go through, and part of it is kind of first bringing community with us to understand the extent of the risk, and then we'll go through those processes of looking at what some of the options are. And so Sue and I are happy to facilitate some additional kind of professional sessions through this process as well. So we'll be doing the community side of things along with so yeah, keep an eye out on any of the council comms coming out.
Great. So that was council encouraging us to be involved, just for those who can't hear that through the microphone. I've got one more question and then I'll open it up to the floor for more questions, and it's perhaps for all the panel members to talk a little bit about timeframes. So we've got Chris, you've talked a little bit about the need for a spatial plan. I've heard both Chris and Greg talk about a 100-year view and what we're doing with that. I've also was reading about Kendra Douglas in the newspapers about a year ago. She was talking about the Boulder Bank and how she's been walking out there every day, well not every day, but often for 18 years. And in the last 3 years is really noticing a bit of difference of what's happening in the Boulder Bank, and it's almost like our natural seawall that we have. So I'm curious about timeframes, as in how long we think we've got the Boulder Bank for and what's likely to happen with the Boulder Bank. And any other timeframe comments that the panel has to say about how this that the next 100 years that Greg and Chris are talking about, how that might plan out. Can you help us start to envisage what might happen over that 100 years? Chris, I'll start with you again.
Thanks, Katrina. Yeah, look, I guess you know, we know it's gonna be a hard time, and it's gonna get harder as we approach, you know, 100 years out. Things are going to get tougher. So I suppose, you know, for me, that's one of the key things we can do, is to be starting to visualize what that future might look like in those scenarios of, if we do nothing, or if we do very little, what are the areas that are going to be hit, and how would they be hit? So that we can actually say, look, that's one track. It's probably one we don't want to go down. What are some other scenarios? Where might seawalls help us out for a time? Where might managed retreat be a good place to start carrying out some managed retreat, and actually start to look at how Nelson might look in the future. And to me, that's a really, that's kind of turning climate change on its head to some extent, to say, look, here's an opportunity for us to decide how we respond, how we look, how we change Nelson to survive, to be able to be around for another 160 odd years. So look, I think those things are all what we need to be doing. In terms of the Boulder Bank question, You know, look, I know there was some damage during Cyclone Kāhui to the boulder bank. I don't know if there's been much research done on how it will be impacted by continued and ongoing storms and storms of greater intensity over time on top of sea level rise. My gut sense is that it's going to be, you know, it's going to be breached at some stage, at some points, and we need to figure out how we manage that. You know, the very coastal processes, and Greg talked a little bit about those, the very coastal processes themselves are likely to be changing with climate change. So I don't think we can assume that we'll have, you know, the same factors involved in what created the boulder bank continuing into the future.
There's a couple of things. So I'm often learning what's happened before, and even around the world and in New Zealand, people have experienced, you know, things like this in the past, and we can learn from it. As far as the consultant with the community, the Kapiti Coast District Council did it, and Christchurch City Council did it, and got bit back hard from some very vocal ratepayers who were concerned about the property, you know, values. So there's something to learn there about how you engage with the community. The other thing that I was thinking of was time frames. There's a very good initiative up in Auckland called King Tides, and they've got a Facebook page which I follow. But every King Tide, they have community people in the community go. They're right into it. And they go take photos of the high tide, where it is, and then they say, you know, so that's an extreme tide now. But in 30 years' time, it's going to be quite a normal tide. So it's giving them a picture of what it looks like in the future, where the water levels are going to be and what the effect is and all that. I think that it's a great tool for educating people is something very real like that.
Well, I think from an architectural point of view, 2030 is an important date. You know, we need to be reducing the carbon that goes into our buildings and how our buildings function. 2050, you know, we've also got our commitments under the Paris Agreement, and so hitting those targets is going to be really difficult. I mean, we need to fundamentally change our mindset about how we're actually designing buildings. And the concept of a zero carbon building, from what I can find, has only really been around for probably 2 years. There's not that many certified zero carbon buildings in the world at the moment. Maybe there's 3 or 4. You know, one of them's owned by Google, and you know, they're not exactly a low carbon organisation, I would think. So just we need to be acting now, and we need to be acting very quickly. I mean, even the legislation is looking at changing. They're reviewing the building code at the moment. Obviously, we put a submission in for that. They're talking about 2035 as a target for zero carbon buildings. We suggested that needed to be earlier than that. And to answer your question about personal responsibility around carbon and emissions and what we're doing, I think the sooner we actually take personal responsibility around that, the sooner things will start changing. Because if collectively as engineers and architects start taking personal responsibility for that, it will start changing our thinking and our mindset around how we're actually doing what we do.
Adding to that, first step is to measure your emissions. You can do that either through ECOS or Toitu, and once you learn how much emissions you're producing through your work, then you can try to reduce, you know, what's carbon intensive and what's other good options. And in the short term, I'd say it's probably a good idea to be intensifying, you know, townships away from the coast, like Brightwater or maybe Wakefield, but it's got a bit of a fault line nearby, so I'm not sure about Wakefield so much. But and that would allow, you know, more residents to move into those areas if coastal areas get damaged. And we need to think about the transport as well. Like we are heavily reliant on cars, especially in this region. But we could switch to electric cargo bikes, that allows to carry up to 4 children. And, that sort of infrastructure could go in rather than just primarily focusing on cars. In the long term, from an ecologist point of view, we are going to experience water scarcity even much harder than what we are experiencing right now. So, and if we're going to have more timber buildings, because of reduced carbon budget, it's going to have fire risks. So does that mean should we be starting installing water tank in individual houses so that we are prepared for fire risks? And also, as the temperature increases, the crop that we grow in our region might be affected as well. Like stone fruit needs frost, but they may not grow as well. So should we be diversifying, horticultural field as well? And grain is New Zealand's weakness, so maybe we could look into diversifying those grains and fruit and stuff to suit future climate.
Thank you to everyone on the panel. Lots of good answers. So I'm happy to take some from the floor, and I'll just repeat the question after I've heard it.
I guess it's a comment, but also a question to the council. It seems that whenever the loudest voices are always social impacts, and I think unless we have some really good financial modelling that suggests how everyday people are going to be affected by the cost of this infrastructure or the alternatives, then we're not going to get engagement with the community. I think that's what we need. So for council and people who are involved in this plan, to look at, if we do abandon wood, what does that mean financially for the community? And what does it mean to protect it? It's very simple terms in terms of rates, in terms of future amenity. Until we've got that kind of real picture about what individuals, how individuals are affected, so engagement with those people that are geographically.
So Chris, you probably can't hear that, but the request is about financial modelling for the average person, how everyone's affected really. Like, what is the cost if we protect the wood, if we abandon the wood? How does it affect us, widespread as a community, and how do we deal with it? And so I guess it was a request for a good understanding of the financial impacts of these options as well. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And certainly, we hear about the costs of climate impacts and particularly sea level rise. It's going to be expensive. And we've heard of things where people have said, look, a lot of councils aren't going to be able to afford to deal with it themselves. It's going to require central government assistance. But we don't know what those costs are. We don't know how they compare. And this is, a key piece of information in my mind that we need to get a better handle on. How does the cost of building a seawall and defending for somewhere like the wood compare with longer term costs of managed retreat? And what is it that people want to have? I think, I mentioned earlier the sort of examples. I think it was Yuki in Denmark and in the Netherlands, in terms of having not much higher ground to go to, whereas we do, but also they don't have the seismic risks that we have. So, I always think of the idea of places near the coast in New Zealand being below sea level as being quite a bad idea from that risk perspective. So we need to be thinking about all of those things. And to me, that's part of the discussion, part of the community decision making, is saying, what can we afford? What is central government going to be able to afford also, and how are we going to prioritise where we spend our limited funds?
So when will we expect to get some of that in the Nelson perspective?
Good question. Look, I think we're having discussions, and I'm having discussions with MFE and others around you know, what tools exist internationally, for example, around estimating some of those costs. How applicable might any tools be to New Zealand if they exist at all? It may be that they don't. So, you know, the sort of cost-benefit approach or multi-criteria analysis, those sorts of things, you know, that exist. To what extent can we develop those to be specific for New Zealand or to the Nelson situation? And I think that's part of the challenge, is because every situation in terms of adaptation to sea level rise is going to be quite unique. And coming back to that question about seismic risk, seismic hazard, you know, what we have to deal with in New Zealand is quite different from what the Dutch or the Danish have to deal with. So we have to build that into our thinking, and we have to be able to, you know, pull together some of that local information about our situation as well.
Thanks, Chris. We look forward to it at some stage then. Other questions from the floor? What else would we like to know from the panel or from, yeah?
I've got a quick question. Firstly, thank you for speaking to us. My question is, as engineers, architects, designers, and planners, we're around here, you guys have already partly answered the question, but how do we stand up in front of our communities, colleagues, and be leaders in this kind of space, as in climate activists and coastal other issues? What can we do as kind of professionals on a day-to-day kind of influence these things?
That's a great question. The question is, as engineers and architects and other professionals, how do we stand up? How do we speak out and be activists in this space at the moment?
Well, I came up with a whole lot of negative examples, and there was, in those examples, there were, you know, landscape architects, there were engineers, there were fish passage experts who all supported the applicant in applying for consents to put those things in, that sort of thing, you know. So I think we have an obligation to go back to the clients and say, is this a good idea? I know you want this, but you know, have you thought it through? It's going to cost this much. It's going to have this sort of impact. I don't think it's going to do what you want it to do. You've got to go back to them with those sorts of things rather than saying, oh yeah, we could do that.
Small bites. So just nibble away. Keep, you know, conversations in offices around certain things. Just every now and then throw a thought in there that, you know, eventually those thoughts will be mirrored by other people in the office, and they'll start to look at things slightly differently. So just keep working at it and start speeding it up too, possibly too.
I'm not an engineer or architect, but I would say if you are specialized in concrete or steel, you know, those heavy emission heavy you know, products, then I would suggest that you would diversify and look into, you know, like laminating timber or, you know, low carbon options, because that's where the future is going globally. I think that's probably from me.
Chris, have you got anything to add to that?
Not a lot. No, I think echoing what the others have said, but I just reflect on, you know, the fact that we tend to do what we know, and you know, for this issue, we need to be breaking out from what we know and being prepared to embrace what we don't know. And you know, reflecting on that comment from Greg that, and I saw Ian Taylor speak from TaylorMade in Dunedin, the tech company. I saw him speak a few years ago, and one of his sort of catch cries was when he would ask one of his computer engineers about, you know, can we do this in the software, or can we program this? He'd always get the answer, don't see why not. And it was kind of a, you know, a pro-positive response that, you know, instead of the answer being, oh no, that's too hard, it's always I don't see why not. And that sort of became the catch cry for his company. Let's give it a try. Let's do this. You know, let's do something different. Let's create something different. And those are the things that have been successful for them.
And I think I'll just add a little bit to that as well. As the Businesses for Climate Action, one of the things that we are doing is trying to bring the community together more so that we can do this together. And so we're not doing this so much as individuals. I think there's a big transition for us to make to this low carbon economy that will be in different places and a lot of transition. So the more that we can actually come together and be a community to make this transition, the lot easier it will be for us. Whether it's sharing ideas, sharing things that have worked and haven't worked, and really getting in far more cooperation and competition in the community. And I think the top of the South, we've got a great opportunity because of the size of the community. We're connected. We can actually make this transition a lot better than some of the other communities in New Zealand and around the world. So I think that's my thing, is like, can we have more of this where we're coming together and saying, okay, well, what do we want to do? How do we do this? Yeah. Next question, yes.
Just building on that conversation, I wonder how many projects are underway in this community at the moment that might be vulnerable to sea level rise in the next 50 or 100 years. And if you think about those projects that are live and underway now, what would the conversation potentially have been with the client about that project, and what would you as engineers and designers and architects have needed in the toolkit to be able to engage with you? What is it that you need to be able to have those conversations or have that advocacy role and still deliver for your client?
So good question. So the question is about the projects that we have underway already that will be facing sea level issues, sea level rise issues in the next 50 years. What is it that would make it easier for us to have conversations with our clients and to be more confident in this space? Is that a question for the room or the panel?
Anyone.
Is there anyone in the room who'd like to speak to that? I mean, yeah.
Well, I just wanted to add a supplementary question to it, though, to the panelists. I think what Chris has said, what you've said, Katrina, that we need to engage with the community. That's great. I think one thing that's really valuable in that engagement is actually having case studies and resources to have those conversations around. Without that, something in the back pocket. And I wondered, with a note to that, whether the panelists had any key, recommended resources and or case studies specifically related to response to sea level rise, that they would have brought forth in these conversations that they might have had with the client, and that they would recommend others to check out.
So the question is, are there good resources and case studies that could be useful to have these conversations with the client about, to make us more confident? What are the recommended ones?
I can come up with a whole lot of examples. One particular comes to mind is Whaihanga Beach in the Bay of Plenty. In the 70s, there's some dramatic pictures of houses falling into the sea there. Now, and one of the responses was to throw car bodies over the scarp. I think the car bodies are still there, but in the intervening time, coastal processes changed, and the beach at Whaihanga marched out 400 metres. But of course, there still was private property title. Where the sea is now land or private property. So the person wanted to develop the area, and the council said, well, hang about, we've got proof that the sea was here. And so the developer came up with a solution, or I suppose every consent is a negotiation at the end of the day, but he put removable houses there that could be quite easily picked up and moved away if needed, once, if the coast ever come back there. So I don't know if that answers, but it's a great example of a solution.
I suppose one that's maybe not a positive example, but there's, I suppose, a couple of towns in the North Island which the council's actually retreating back from already. So insurance companies are no longer insuring the properties on the coast. Was it Matata? Yeah. and Waihi, so intense. So there's already communities in New Zealand that are struggling to get insurance. So it's an example that this is starting to affect us in specific ways. So if we continue to do what we're doing, it's going to continue to be more widespread.
I think it's in Waihi. No, Waihi Council have made a regulation. So if you are wanting to build in vulnerable area, it has to be removable, and they prohibit using concrete because concrete makes it quite difficult to remove. So these things, if they spread nationally along the vulnerable area, that would be a good move, I think.
Chris, have you got any suggested resources for the engineers and architects to use this
Yeah,
space?
absolutely. So, look, there's a lot of good resources around through Ministry for the Environment, New Zealand Coastal Guidance. There's a New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement that I think Greg had on his slides. There's also local government New Zealand's put out some really good resources around sea level rise and impacts as well. So there is a whole lot of good information which is specific to New Zealand. The Deep South National Science Challenge has some good resources about impacts on the insurance industry, impacts on communities and society, which are worth having a look at. So there are good things out there. The dynamic adaptive pathways planning approach has been tested in a number of cases around New Zealand. So Hawke's Bay, I think, was one of those examples, and there is, I think, a project report from that. So what else? I guess coming to the question of, how do you talk to clients? I think probably referring them to the likes of those coastal inundation maps that are coming out next month is probably a good place to direct them and be able to say, look, have you thought of this? Have you? And if it's stuff that's happening now, if it's a project that's still underway, what is it that can be altered or amended or considered to deal with those, with that sort of potential impact?
I suppose another thing to add to that is having a collective knowledge within the industry as well, knowing that if one person is suggesting that area is potentially not a good idea to develop, knowing that developer doesn't go to the next architect or designer to just do that work. So having that agreement across the industry and having it's kind of taking that competition out of it, that if I don't do it, somebody else will. And I think that we're a little bit guilty of going down that path probably a little bit too often.
Thanks, Duncan. One last question. Yeah, Lisa.
Hi, I'm Lisa Marco. I work for Ministry for Environment and Climate Change Education Space, so I'm involved in developing new legislation. Really interesting.
Could you stand up, please?
I would like to hear from you as what would be your 1-minute elevator pitch to climate change?
So this is Lisa from MEFA's request. Is a 1-minute elevator pitch to the Climate Change Minister? Is it a request or a...
If you met them in the elevator.
If we met the Climate Change Minister in the elevator, you've got 1 minute. What do you say?
What would you like to hear?
Is it still David Parker? Is that it? We're waiting to see.
Yeah.
He was, wasn't he? James Shaw, that's right, yes. David Parker was the one before that. Oh, yeah, what would I...
You've lost 20 seconds already.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know what to say to it, but I would introduce myself and say who I was and what my interest was, and so that we could start a relationship. So he knows my organisation and I know and who I am and that sort of thing. I don't think I'd go into anything else about that because I would imagine he's very well informed.
I'm not really supposed to say this, but I would probably just say that you need to meet my wife. I'm in serious trouble now.
I guess, now that New Zealand first out of the way, I've always say, yep, it's green right now, go ahead and get it done as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Yuki. Chris, what would you say? G'day, mate.
Yeah, James, how you doing? Look, I think the key point there, collaboration is so important, and we've talked about that through this panel discussion. That we've got to collaborate as a community here in Nelson, but we've got to collaborate across organisations and across across levels of government, nationally and internationally as well. So I'd be saying, look, let's collaborate between MFE, between the ministry, between central government and local government to ensure that we've got consistency around what we're doing, and that we are aware of each other's perspectives, and that we're moving forward together in the same direction. So look, I think that engagement, that connectivity, that networking, the value that there is in talking with each other, even if we don't have the answers, and that's, I think, where we need to be heading. I think someone made the point before about you need information to be able to provide, to talk about and to fall back on. I totally agree with that as well, but we need to just start talking and be prepared to support each other.
Great, thank you very much. And I'll just hand back to James to finish up with the evening. And before I do, I've got one challenge for all of us, is when we head back to our desk tomorrow and we're back into the business as usual, let's make a decision now of one thing we're going to be doing differently, and really get clear on that, so that this goes from being a good idea and an interesting talk to something that's going to be different in our work life tomorrow.